Hey everybody, this is Mike with Free-Roaming Photography, and in this video I am going to teach you how to effectively photograph the northern lights so you get some really stunning bright shots. And just a quick reminder, if you do want to do private photography workshops with me, I do offer those, and we can do night photography. We can capture the Milky Way or the moon or anything else, especially northern lights if they're out. So if you want more information on that, check out my website at the link in the description down below. But before we get ahead of ourselves, it's vital that you understand how to use manual mode. So if you're not familiar with it, or if you just have a vague understanding of it, be sure to check out this video so that you can understand how to work manual mode better and be comfortable when shooting night photography, especially auroras, because there's going to be a lot of terminology we use that's going to define a lot of the settings we need. And before we get into the specifics of how to actually photograph the auroras, we're going to debunk a couple of myths. The first is that you can only see the northern lights in far northern latitudes. This is obviously false. As everyone remembers from May of 2024, there was a massive aurora outburst where they were photographed as far south as the Florida Keys. So obviously you don't need to be in the far northern latitudes to see them, but it's a lot more consistent up there because that's where most of the activity is. So the farther north you go, the more reliable the opportunity is. But depending on solar activity and weather, you don't necessarily need to be all the way up there to see them. It's just you're not going to see them as frequently. Next is that the northern lights are only visible in the winter. Obviously, this is also false because you might remember that May of 2024 storm. That's definitely not the winter. Even in the far northern latitudes, things are melting. It's more like spring. Northern lights can occur year-round, but because it is more reliable up north, you really only get nights long enough to see them in the winter that far north. In reality, as long as there's strong enough solar activity, you could see them any night of the year, spring, summer, fall, or winter. So the rules of northern lights photography are pretty similar to standard night photography, especially if you're doing a dark night sky like a Milky Way, but there are a few subtle differences. Just like with Milky Way photography, you want as wide open of an aperture as you can get. Ideally something like f2.8 or lower, and this is going to depend on your lens's capabilities. Some lenses go down to 1.4, some lenses go down to 1.8. If you only have a lens that goes down to f4, and that's all you got but you want to try it, you can try it, but you're not going to get great results. You need that wider open aperture to really account for the amount of darkness that's there. And granted, northern lights produce some light, but still f4 is usually not low enough to get a really bright and vibrant shot of the auroras. Now, depending on the intensity for the ISO, you'll want something high as well, something in between the 4,000 to 8,000 range. And that's really going to depend on just how bright and how strong that activity is. If it's a much weaker storm and you can just kind of barely make them out on the northern horizon, especially if that's all your camera's getting, then you're definitely going to need to push it up because you just don't have as much light providing that extra illumination that a stronger solar system would provide. Whereas if it's really strong and you can see them all over the northern part of the sky or even beyond, then you can get away with a much lower ISO, such as 4,000 or something like that. But the main reason you want that ISO so high is because you really don't want your shutter speed to exceed something like 5 or 6 seconds. That's typically what you're going to want to be shooting for if you're shooting with a wide angle lens or even an ultra wide, something like 20 millimeters or less. If you're more zoomed in, maybe you have a 30 millimeter lens or something even more, and you want to try to capture the auroras with something more close up versus the big wide shots, then you're really only going to want a shutter speed of something like 2 seconds or somewhere in that range. Now, if you're used to doing night photography, you know that that's a really short amount of time to absorb the night sky. And the reason for this is because that shorter shutter speed is going to preserve all those big ribbons that the auroras make as they dance across the sky. So you want to really capture that and freeze that, because if you use a longer shutter speed, something like 15 or 20 seconds, all those ribbons are all going to be blurred together and you're just basically going to get a big blob of color, which can also be beautiful, but it doesn't create quite as much drama as preserving those big streaks of color going through the sky. Now, a lot of this is going to depend on the intensity of the auroras themselves. If they're really strong and really intense, you can get away with a lower ISO and also get a faster shutter speed quite easily because there's so much more light being poured into the sky than usual. However, if it's not that strong of a storm and you're just kind of seeing them on the northern horizon, or if really only your camera is seeing them, then you really do want to crank up that ISO, something 8,000 in that range, especially with modern cameras. If you have an older camera, you might want to cap it at 5,000 or 6,400 or something like that. But At the same time, a slower shutter speed, such as something like 8 seconds, won't have that much of effect on the ribbon since they're so much farther away. The time it takes them to capture them moving isn't going to be quite as quick as if they're right up close and filling the sky. Now, similarly, if there is any moonlight, maybe it's a full moon or a quarter moon or something like that, your ISO settings don't need to be as sensitive. You can bring those back down as well, because if you've done night photography before with a moon, you know that it creates a lot more light than it appears. And if you haven't, well, it's a good way to test it out. Go test out a new moon, a quarter moon, a full moon, and see that difference between how much illumination is created on the landscape with just a little bit of moonlight. So these settings should get you going the next time there's an aurora outburst, whether it's weak or strong. Definitely let me know if you have any questions or comments down in the comments below. If you want to come out with me for a private photography workshop, look for that link in the description. And please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, if you found it helpful. There's plenty more coming. And thank you for watching, and happy trails.